that early period is very important for a lot of the reasons all of us are aware, trying to give the chick a stronger start, establishing that healthy, microbiome and just a healthy gut environment in general.
Welcome to the Poultry Podcast Show. Today I'm here with Dr. Kevin Bolek. Welcome.
Hey, thank you very much. Good to be here.
I'm really excited to chat with you today about what you're doing currently in the poultry industry. But first, I want to hear, how did you get into chickens?
Yeah, that's a great question. One I get asked a lot by people that are first finding out what I do for a living. So yeah, I didn't actually grow up in agriculture or anything like that. I didn't really get into chickens until later in undergraduate. So some folks from the Midwest Poultry Consortium actually were giving a presentation at Michigan State, my alma mater, and it sounded really interesting and thought I'd give it a try. Got into it and ended up really enjoying the topics, really enjoying the people. Didn't even really have much of a research background, to be honest with you. And then got into my master's in 2011, and I just got hooked from there. And so it's really just that simple. I just really enjoyed it after having some exposure to it.
Sounds like you had the Velcro effect. You're just stuck.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's right.
So since completing your PhD, where did your career path take you?
Yeah, so I've jumped around a little bit after my PhD was complete, but mainly stayed on the feed additive side. So I started at Elanco Animal Health and Food Animal Therapeutics, looking at essentially replacements for antibiotics, in-feed antibiotics, mainly focusing on immunomodulators. And we looked at different types. Sometimes they're biologics, sometimes they're small molecule chemistries, things of that nature. And got the opportunity to meet a lot of great people and work in different species as well, but still maintaining the primary focus on poultry. After that, I jumped around a little bit. I worked at a startup in San Diego for a bit, developing novel direct-fed microbials for chickens primarily, and then spent a little bit of time at Cargill as well, looking at that was just more of general poultry products, different technologies for poultry management, things of that nature. And then ended up landing at Phibro Animal Health, which is my current position, and as the Microbials Innovation Director for the animal health side of their microbials business. And in a nutshell, what my role is there is leading the development of new direct-fed microbials. And this time it's more of an all-species role. So that's been really interesting for me to branch out, but certainly a good deal of our time and effort is spent on chickens because it is so important.
When it comes to raising healthy animals, you need more than the right solutions. You need the right partner who brings decades of industry expertise and a global team to put that knowledge to work for the advancement of your operation. At Phibro Animal Health Corporation, we are proud to work with you as your trusted partner.
I've heard you use the term probiotics and DFMs, and I know they're different, but some of the people listening might not know what the overlap or what the difference is. Maybe could you give us what an idea of someone coming from the industry working with them would describe them as?
Sure. In Liz, I tend to use them interchangeably. I mean, because you could use probiotics as the whole, it's more of a classical definition in the sense of, okay, they're going to impart health benefits to the host. And it's more of a phrase you might hear on the human side, but it's used on the animal side as well, where direct-fed microbials, I feel, on the animal side, technically we're feeding something that's a feed ingredient, that's an accepted feed ingredient. And so there's maybe some little nuances and deviation there, but we tend to use them interchangeably.
Yeah. All right. So what have you done in the probiotic or the DFM space over the course of your career? I know that it seems like there could be several different focuses or opportunities based on the species you're working with, but also just the company or the product you're working with.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have so within Phibro Animal Health, we've done a lot of work around our flagship direct-fed microbial, which is called MicroLife Prime. So that's a 4 strain, so 4 different species of bacillus for performance and also some data related to pathogen mitigation in poultry. So we've done a lot of work building that up and supporting that, but we've also had the opportunity to move into different species as well, like looking into swine and cattle. And so from a research standpoint, when we're moving into those species, typically it's to try to address something that's obviously relevant to that industry. And so we do research maybe in specific disease models sometimes. And again, not saying that direct-fed microbials are therapeutics or drugs, but we tend to look at them in those disease contexts to see if there's any positive correlations that ultimately improve performance. Because at the end of the day, that's what they're meant to do, is put in the diet and improve performance. But again, we've stretched from poultry, we're looking into cattle, swine, aquaculture. So again, there's several different applications within some of those species that we've been looking at. Some are still more in the research phase, but they're new and exciting, and so it's sort of a diverse application that you can have for direct-fed microbials.
Yeah, it sounds like there's definitely a lot of options. So when you're talking about selecting a probiotic that you might want to use, what are some of the things to think about? I know the companies sell different ones. There's a lot of proprietary components, right, to those, but can you maybe speak to the differences between single or multi-strains or anything that would be a good selection criteria for use in an operation?
Sure. Yeah. So let's start with I'll keep it more poultry centric maybe, and so maybe focus on some of the selection criteria, because I think that's a pretty sort of broad subset of topics that we can apply to any direct-fed microbial, frankly. So any strong direct-fed microbial, again, it's got to ultimately at the end of the day have an effect on performance. I know that's very straightforward and to the point, but that's kind of the end game, right? But on the front end, when we're looking at a particular strain to research, we can sort of de-risk the process. So for example, Fibro and several other companies have their own libraries of many different microbial strains of different species, et cetera. And so one of the ways that you say, okay, well, I want to design a really high-end direct-fed microbial or a best-in-class direct-fed microbial, et cetera, whatever your goal is. And so the best way, at least on the front end, to do that is approach it from a few different perspectives. So we tend to look at things like, of course, improvements in intestinal integrity and gut health. That's a layup, right? That's an obvious one that you want to have an associated effect. We also look at the ability to inhibit pathogens, that could be various pathogens or maybe a pathogen of interest that you have for a particular situation. And also, especially in chickens, I think immunomodulation has, kind of more and more importance and attention, just because there's a fair amount of data to suggest that when you, to use a catch-all phrase, prime the immune system, right, then birds, broilers specifically I'm talking about here, tend to do a little bit better. And that's performance-wise, or even some strong associations with resolving infections a little better. And things of that nature. Mm-hmm. So when you're looking at those things, I think it's nice to have some maybe high throughput in vitro methodology to test each of those things, and there's ways you can do that, and then start to validate them in animal studies based on that. And then not only will that help you design a better DFM to improve performance, but I think whether you're a researcher and you're trying to do it and convince your peers in the scientific community, or whether you're working for a company and you need to convince your customers, it's going to go over a lot better when you just have that supporting data and mechanism of action, especially because there's plenty of stigma around the efficacy of DFMs that you have to overcome if you're going to design a product, for example. Yeah. So then your second question, you had asked me about single versus multi-species, and there are some products that are single species and they do just fine, right? It's not necessarily that every blend that has just one species in it is bad or something of that nature. But what we've tend to notice in our research in-house, and there's some published literature on this as well that applies to chickens and different species, but is when you combine different high performing strains of microbes. So each of them is doing something on their own and you can have a measurable effect. Mm-hmm. The research tends to suggest that when you combine all of those, you have either an additive or in some cases maybe even a synergistic effect. Mm-hmm. And so the theory behind that is it's kind of loose, but it's just related to the fact that, well, the gut environment's a very complicated environment, right? And there's lots of different things going on. So if you have more modalities where you have, let's say, one strain improves barrier integrity really well, okay, then you have another strain that, okay, we talked about immunomodulation, that does the immunomodulation really well. You feed those individually, birds do well, but you combine them and lo and behold, you have even better performance. So I think it's just you have more tools in the toolbox to address what's going on in the gut. So it's more of a de-risking exercise in that sense too when you're combining strains.
Yeah. I've kind of wondered this just from some of the work we've done with probiotics. Is there a critical mass? I mean, you can see how many colony forming units, and even for human probiotics, there's all these information on the bottle. Like there's so many colony forming units you compare to something else and it's got less or more. Right. But right. I mean, other than the need to be consistently fed, do you kind of have an idea if you were of maybe a minimum or a species, or you know what I mean? Is there an accepted range for minimum efficacy, I guess is the question.
Yeah, and it's a great question, and I think a lot of it's context dependent. And so depending on what situation you're in, because it may be different for if you're feeding it to calves versus broilers, right? So, I mean, if you have something that's in the hundreds of thousands, I feel like typically that's sort of the minimum ballpark for efficacy. I mean, if you have anything that's, at lower, it probably tends not to work as well. But certainly, we have products that are fed in the hundreds of thousands and they work great. And there's even some that are more in like 1 million colony forming units, say per gram of finished feed or something like that. Yeah. And that can be advantageous too. So a lot of that is just strain dependent. And so you're going to have a range of efficacy. And I think it's more of tuning in to which strain, tuning into that individual strain, what kind of range works the best. And some of that's based on cost as well, because you're going to have, at least from an industry perspective, from a research perspective, you could obviously explore a really wide range and see what happens in the animal. From an industry perspective, there will be a point where you're going to get diminishing returns on adding that in. And so it doesn't make sense to add it beyond a certain point in some instances. Yeah. So if that gives you a little bit of an idea, I know that's a little bit of a punt, but it really does depend. I would say typically maybe in the hundreds of thousands of CFUs per gram of feed is more kind of standard where you're going to see an effect. Yeah.
Do you have a feeling for, I know for some of the places you've worked in the past, you were developing novel strains or exploring, and maybe you still are exploring novel species, but do you have a general feeling for, is there a bigger impact on introducing a novel species or introducing maybe a lactobacillus that does something just a little different to a population that already has a lot of lactobacillus? Like, so is it novelty or is it just more members of a certain species?
Sure. And are you talking about on a biological level within the animal, you mean, as far as what's happening?
Yeah, like does the animal care if we assume probiotics are not, because it would be an intricate experiment, right, to prove that a bacteria you fed actually colonized. So we just have to assume does its job and leaves. But is it the novelty of something that's not already there that helps something, or is it just more members of a beneficial that might already exist?
Yeah, Liz, it could be a little bit of column A, a little bit. It's a great question, awesome question, but it could be a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B, because there are some, let's say, AFCO-approved species, but there's different strains, for example. So we have and we discuss this a lot actually, because we, our primary library consists of a lot of bacillus. It's not the only things,
sure.
aren't the only things in there, but we have a lot of bacillus in there, for just to give you an example. But not all bacillus are exactly the same, and sometimes they can differ quite a bit as far as the biological outcome or the zootechnical outcome, even though it's the same species, right? So I don't think it would be fair for me to say that, oh no, it's pure novelty. I think there's lots of good AAFCO approved strains that or AAFCO approved species that a strain or a variant can actually have a pretty demonstrable positive effect, right?
Yeah.
But however, there are looking into novel strains, I will say that can unlock some potential as well, because there's different mechanisms that aren't typically associated maybe with AAFCO strains, or approved strains in whatever your geography might be. So there's value to that as well. I think a lot of why that hasn't come to fruition is things like regulatory hurdles and customer acceptance and things of that nature. That's a really high level view of that, but that's my 2 cents on that. But so it's a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B, really.
So from a manufacturer standpoint, you manufacture for poultry, and that let's say turkeys too. Do you think each of those species needs their own specific formulation? So broilers, layers, and turkeys, and maybe even ducks. I don't know how many probiotic, what's going on in the duck land. I'd like to know, I guess. Or are they similar enough that you could see benefits across them? So do you need species-specific probiotic products, I guess is the question.
Yeah, I would say for a lot of and that's a great question, and that's to be fair, that's not something I've explored in great detail. So I'll talk in generalizations here a little bit, but yeah, we see sometimes where we'll have strains that we manufacture, and they have beneficial effects in different types of poultry, whether we're talking about laying hens, for example, or something of that nature. But I think on occasion, it is beneficial to maybe design something that's just for either that species, or sometimes even just maybe a company location or locations. And we've explored that as well on given occasions, and sometimes that can have a beneficial effect. So I think, again, it comes to those quality strains, especially in poultry, where if you see really great measurable, repeatable effects, then they tend to do well in different settings within poultry. I think really what you have to watch out for if you're designing direct-fed microbials is cross species, or sort of between species. So if you have one for swine and one for poultry, it's not necessarily going to work in swine, which is I'm probably stating the obvious there, but that tends to be the experience. Sometimes, again, they'll do well, and you can have sort of cross species lack of efficacy, for lack of a better word, but you can see differences even across species. But I think that's usually the bigger gap, where if you're coming up with a new one, where it'll fail is if you have something designed for poultry, but then you want to put it in aqua or swine or something like that.
Yeah. Have you come across a strain or a species that you just love? Like, it always seems to be benefit, like it's a workhorse. Is there something you go back to all the time?
Sure. Yeah, we have some strains of me personally. There are some strains I've seen, I'll say in-house strains, that are, again, very common, AAFCO approved species, let's say, but tend to work really well. I won't get into too many specifics on that, but yes, there are favorites, and again, some of them aren't necessarily a novel, far out microbe, that's not approved yet. So absolutely, yes, I do have favorites.
Don't tell them that. There's a bank of millions of them, I'm sure, that are all waiting.
I don't want to make be bad, but
they want to be drafted to your next experiment.
Just between you and I. So.
So can you maybe categorize what, if I started feeding probiotics, and you can pick any setting you want, like, I don't know, growing broiler with or without a disease challenge. Could you give us an idea of how they're benefiting the animal just in the production setting? Like what are kind of the modes of actions or the big categories of how probiotics could be used to benefit production?
Yeah, so I can tell you what I what we've experienced and what I've experienced in different production settings. So for specific scenarios, I feel like that a lot of I'll talk about broilers because that's again a big market, primary
Yeah.
DFM market in poultry, right? And so with broilers, I think where we see a lot of benefit is early on in the animal. Now, I'm not, most people, if they have a product, they oftentimes like to feed it out through the whole life of the animal, which has benefits. But if I had to narrow it down and talk to something about or think of something about that has maybe the key importance in the administration period. As you might guess, that early period is very important for a lot of the reasons all of us are aware. Trying to give the chick a stronger start, establishing that healthy microbiome and just a healthy gut environment in general as well. And so oftentimes if we have a farm, let's say, that's having a problem, you can see changes in even in sort of mid-cycle mortality and you'll have livability increase up and even to close out. And now obviously we look for changes in performance as well, or improvements in performance, I should say, is what we aim for as well. But oftentimes you'll see a problem farm like that where livability will get a little bit better. And I think and that's again a multifactorial thing, just because you're dealing with a living organism that's being fed. If it was therapeutics, like an antibiotic's relatively straightforward. You know exactly how it's working, and so I think there's some of that element, but it's I think a combination of those elements that maybe we discussed earlier in the talk that are all working together in concert that are essentially making the gut healthier, and then it's sort of a snowball effect after that leads to improved performance. So
Yeah.
I know that's a bit generalized, but it is a multifactorial, multimodal, ways in which they're working.
Yeah. So with changes, especially in broilers, to the antibiotic-free programs, and maybe even in some of the ionophores only, but basically programs that have different tools available to them to treat disease, how can you use the DFM or a probiotic in those programs where maybe that is the only tool they have available? Like, what does an effective program look like?
Yeah, no, it's another good question. So and that's a situational dependent thing, may be dependent on the issue you're having. So, for example, if you're having an issue with salmonella, we like to tell you like to put a DFM in with breeders, for example, as well.
Oh, sure.
And if you have that in combination, even with your production flock, that tends to maybe is associated with improvements there in that respect.
Yeah.
But the nice thing about DFMs is they're very compatible with various programs. So they're compatible with BioShuttle programs.
Mm-hmm.
We've even seen some synergistic effects when combining with other feed additives and things of that nature. And so one of the things we've looked at on some of our production farms that we worked in the field is that you tend to see the improvements that are going over different feeding programs, right? So it's kind of a good insurance policy to put in there to maybe in the wintertime you're losing a couple points of feed conversion or increase in mortality or whatever, so you can help recover that a little bit. Or maybe you're having a spike in, again, your salmonella, you can try to mitigate that a little bit. So I think it's a good catch-all insurance policy that fits many different production styles.
Yeah. So when you're trying to decide on a probiotic, it sounds like it might need to be fed long term, right? You can't just decide after one flock. You kind of have to test it out. across time or houses or sites?
Yeah, that's correct. That's correct. So it's better to test it that way to really see if you're seeing a difference or not, because of some of the reasons I just mentioned. You're
Hmm.
going across different seasons. Obviously, there's different seasons where if you let's say you only use the direct-fed microbial in a time of year where you're seeing poor performance.
Oh,
Well, if
sure.
you just use it during that time, then maybe you'll see a little bit of an uptick or something like that. But it may also be the problem is so severe that it's really masking any of the
Mm,
positive effects. So typically, we like to when we're trialing it, we like to stretch it multiple cycles so you can see, you can see have a better chance of seeing an effect that way. So, because again, it's not, these aren't antibiotics or something like that, right? These are nutritional feed additives, and so I think again, folks need to, if they're trialing these, really need to give it a chance to see if it's actually working in their
yeah.
program, and a multi-cycle approach is typically the best way to do that.
So I just thought of this because of the feed additive comment, but some probiotics are also available as water treatments, correct?
Correct.
Are
Yes,
are
that's right.
they are there inherent differences in complexity or some other things? Because I know part of the issue for feed is, okay, can it go through pelleting? Does it stand up to heat? But there's got to be, are there more options, I guess, for feed than there are for water, or vice versa? Or are they just different because of the way that they're delivered?
Yeah, I think a lot, it's a preferential thing. So there's different management styles or different ways people want to use direct-fed microbials. Sometimes if they have water-based administration, then it gives them the flexibility to maybe spike it only when they want or when they think
Oh,
they
huh.
need it, right? And
Yeah.
so I think that's a big driver for those differences. So, certainly most companies will have both versions that are available for folks to use. But it's at least in some of my experience, it's been more of a management style thing as to why
Oh,
they want
sure.
to apply those. Mhm.
Yeah. From my understanding, a key of probiotics to be successful in whatever you're considering success is consistency, though, right? Like, you're not going to see a immediate incredible benefit just, dropping the golden pill into the water. Like, you want to be feeding these consistently long term, or at least, if money is limiting in the early days, right? Like,
Correct.
it's
Yeah, that's right.
consistency is key.
Yes, that's right. Consistency is key, absolutely, and that's where the recommendation, and it's a is to really just feed that throughout the whole life of the flock cycle. I mean that kind of gives you the best assurance about with anything that may happen during the flock cycle. But certainly, yes, early if you had to pull it out of a phase, a diet phase, it would be preferential not to pull it out of the earlier one.
Yeah.
Because I think by that time there's less and less good that the DFM can do for your flock if you throw it
Yeah.
at the middle or of certainly the end, right? That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So
Yeah.
yes, yep, it does take time, but earlier I would say is better if you have to choose.
Yeah. So what's your thought about on the research aspect of determining whether or not a probiotic is useful? Um, what are some of your thoughts on people just solely relying on microbiome changes, or some of that more complicated data that we won't collect on farm necessarily for a more complicated trial?
Right. So it kind of sorry, Liz, just to make sure I understand your question correctly, you're asking about when you're doing DFM research,
Yeah.
what else could you look at besides something like the microbiome? Is that am I understanding it correctly
Yeah.
there?
What's the role of whether or not the microbiome is impacted, even? Because I know that's the first thing people think about is, um, you're let's say you're just taking a probiotic, maybe you expect some big changes in your microbiome, and my thought is maybe your microbiome doesn't change, but some other metabolic aspect changes. So when you're evaluating your different probiotics or DFMs or whatever, what is the role of microbiome data, in your selection or other?
Sure. Okay, I got it. Okay, yeah. So with when you're looking at a trial, let's say even if it's I think whether a controlled research trial, that's just an experiment, or if you're looking on an on-farm trial and you're trying to collect what samples you can at
Yeah.
that customer trial, I think the microbiome is always a good one to do. So I think, in some broad strokes, anyways, the microbiome I think gives us a pretty good bead of if we're seeing the probiotic actually do something positive, because in chickens, at least with the thing, well, I feel like at least with the amount of data that's in the research literature now, we can have at least an idea of what maybe a better microbiome looks like versus a worse microbiome. So it does give us more confidence that yes, okay, it's actually doing the job, it's shifting this more or less in the right direction. And I think there's value to that, because it's again, you need to be able to kind of show people on a mechanistic level what your product or your research that you're doing is that something's going on there on a biological level in the gut. But I think it's also valuable to collect extra, obviously, in an experiment. So, let's say in an experimental side, other biomarkers that you can get from the gut is always a good idea, just because there are some tried and true things you can look at, I think, that are also useful to say, okay, the gut environment is good. And I think even to some extent on a farm, like a commercial farm that you might be doing a trial on, I think with that is just collecting as much metadata as you can. So if you're lucky enough, maybe you can get access to some records on mortality or performance. Obviously, if you have, depending on the relationship you have with that commercial farm, metadata is always important, I feel, to tie anything that you're seeing in the microbiome to the reality that the birds are experiencing. And having a extra sample of gut content or two is also always useful, because again, just like on the R&D side, even the commercial side, there's some relevant biomarkers that would give you more confidence. So I think the microbiome is good to measure it, and it's something that we like to measure as well. But additionally, those other biomarkers give you more confidence when you put them together. So just to again, I like to use that word, but to de-risk, right? To show that you're like, okay, yes, it's actually doing something.
Yeah. So, what are some of the shifts that I guess would be you like to see? Like what is something that would indicate that the probiotic is having a benefit, kind of at a large scale?
Yeah, so there are some, and you can look a lot of this in research literature. So I won't belabor the point of looking at specific taxa or anything like that. There's lots of examples in literature of good versus bad taxa, but so to say, good versus bad taxa, right? But there, so I think that there are some key changes that you can look at, and you can see them progress as well. Like if you take the time to try to grab different ages again, if you can. That's all dependent on your situation, your research situation, or your commercial farm situation, that your ability to do that. But I feel like that's one of the things, is you tend to see that progression fairly well. Most times, and maybe not always, but you tend to see it go one way or the other through the age. It's not just all of a sudden it looks great and then it goes to the basement, right? As far as the kind of the microbiome composition. So
key time points would also be really more useful than a single time point for any sort of microbiome.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah, that makes sense. It kind of just goes along with the bird's developing just as quickly as its microbiome, right?
Yeah. I mean, for sure. You'll see that progression. Usually, if the flock is doing well or if they're not doing well, you'll see it progressively get worse.
Yeah. Clostridium suddenly is present. It's in the house. Yeah. Okay, so from a research perspective, or even out in the field perspective, why is the microbiome so important?
Yeah, so I think it's important, absolutely, from a research perspective, and I think that can be in really multiple contexts. And the obviously low hanging fruit here is gut health, right? So
Yeah.
I think interestingly enough, I think it can inform even some of the basic research that like a poultry immunologist like yourself would do, right? Where you're maybe looking at something like, I'm trying to think of a good example to nail this home. So maybe something like resistance to pathogens of any kind of pathogen. So there are cases where you see a chicken, or again, this could demonstrate this in mice as well, where you have a microbiome that's more resistant to whatever pathogen of interest or what other pathogen you might be interested in looking at. And so you say, okay, well, is it the microbiome that's really making the animal resistant, or is it something else? And you do something like a transplant study or something like that, a fecal transplant to try to replicate that. That's something like that, I think, is good from a mechanistic standpoint of what we can figure or what we can glean from, say, for a specific question like what makes animals more resistant to disease. Because in some cases, yeah, there's some strong evidence that the microbiome is actually making them more resistant. Some cases, the microbiome is just a bystander, and it's actually related to some maybe deficiencies in receptors or mutations in receptors, that is either making them more susceptible or resistant. So I think it's actually an important piece of, on sort of a basic biology level, trying to unravel some of that context. In the sense of why it's maybe, if you change it to an application side, why it's important for poultry research or even poultry industry research, you can, think of, again, some obvious ones that actually have some potential. So oftentimes you'll see folks trying to associate certain microbial signatures or microbiome signatures with performance or mortality or something like that. So good, bad, indifferent. What are the microbes in the gut that are associated or not associated with that state? And some folks have tried to leverage the microbiome in the sense that, we see that these maybe rare or maybe not rare, maybe uncommon microbial species are associated with a really high performing bird. Let's see if we can pull those out, cultivate them, feed them back, see what happens. So that's several folks are trying to do that, have done that, etc. So that's just an example of a practical application. And I think that even extends a little bit to maybe like the diagnostic or sort of pseudo diagnostic side, where you're trying to, like we talked about before, trying to see how, the microbiome might be affected on a farm. And whoever is able to get that to the point where it's highly predictive in real time, to where you could affect management decisions, that would be a big deal. So that's not an egg we've been able to crack yet, but in my opinion anyways, but it's certainly that potential is there. So I think it's both, the microbiome research is both important just on the, again, a basic biological researcher side, but also from an industry application standpoint.
I think there's a lot of great people working on the microbiome, but it just, to me, becomes like a bigger black hole every time somebody figures out a little bit more out, because even some of the highest variation is just the site that you're on. I mean, it blows my mind.
And I think folks, there's some phenomenal scientists working in this field, phenomenal scientists in this field working on poultry microbiome that are doing really, really good stuff. But yeah, I think in general, there are some of those traps you can fall into where there's overinterpretation, or you can overcomplicate it. And it makes interpretation more difficult. And so that's always a challenge, is the difficulty of interpretation. I think there's also an issue of sort of paradigms in the microbiome too. Yeah. So, where it may be a good example is taxonomic diversity, more taxonomic diversity being better, lower taxonomic diversity being worse. And there are certainly cases where that's true, but there's plenty of cases in the literature where that's not true. So just say blanketly that increased taxonomic diversity is always better. That's patently false. That's not true. And so I think expressing that though to a broader audience that maybe or maybe not, maybe they do or don't feel that way, but it's one of those hurdles. And so it's
Yeah.
really great research, but it's yeah, there's still work to be done.
Yeah. I think honestly, one of the biggest hurdles that we've had with collaborators is not collecting data, because that's easy, right? It's the analysis of microbiome, metatranscriptome, all this. I mean, you have to be an incredible statistician and computer
Absolutely.
scientist to make sense of that data, and then us simple biologists have to then
That's right.
figure
Yes.
that out on top. So
Yes.
I'm
Yep.
constantly in awe of people who work on the microbiome and metatranscriptome, because they're making just terabytes of data that nobody could get through in a real lifetime. So kudos to
Absolutely.
them.
And it would never move forward without those folks. So no, they are of key importance to that field. And yeah, they're some of the smartest people that I know. So
just Googling on their computer, trying to get it figured out.
That's right.
It's time for our famous three. A worldwide leader in animal nutrition, Adiceo's portfolio of products includes methionine, the full range of vitamins, enzymes, organic selenium, probiotics, mycotoxin management strategies, and palatability products. With such a diverse offering, Adiceo supports its customers with a broad range of expertise, tools, and services to help them maintain a competitive advantage. Adiceo, fueling predictable profits. To learn more, visit Adiceo at www.adiceo.com.
Before we wrap up today, I want to ask you the three questions that we ask all of our guests. And the first one is do you have a favorite poultry-related resource?
Oh, man. So I like the comparative avian nutrition that's written by Kurt Klasing. Not that I read a lot about wild birds, but he's got a lot of, for you nutritionists out there, it's a lot of really good review on just kind of the nutrition and nutritional physiology process. That's actually, it's a good brush up, and it's very easy read. And for those that aren't really have much of a nutrition background, it's a good resource for learning as well. So that's a good nutrition-based one. I'll give you off the top of my head.
I like that. That's a good good example. Do you have a favorite non-poultry resource?
Yes, I do. So I like there's a series of books, and boy, I think it's and I apologize, I'm missing the publisher, but the name is just Mucosal Immunology, and there's a few different mucosal immunology books, but there's different volumes of those, and so let's say just any mucosal immunology book is going to be good. I think that gives a lot of insight. Of course, it's not bird related, but because obviously they're a little further ahead on the human side, that I think there's some valuable insights, and for those researching new ideas related to poultry intestinal health research, I think there's a lot of good ideas that you could try to say, let's transition over into a poultry research setting that probably haven't been done before. So
that's a great suggestion. The last question is, for those entering or wanting to enter the poultry industry, how do you become successful, or how do you remain successful in the industry?
Yeah, so I think, becoming successful, I think, the best piece of advice I can give is try not to, whether it's graduate school or whether it's your first job, try not to sweat the small stuff. Just keep your head, just keep your head down and work it out. It's going to be okay. Just keep your eye fixated on that goal, block out the noise, and you're going to do just fine. I think for maintaining success, let's say in poultry and maybe in animal health in general, I think it behooves oneself to be you'd have a lot of tools in the toolbox. So I got one of my early mentors in the field of poultry, Darren Karcher, gave me that piece of advice, and it was one of the best pieces of advice I've ever got. Where it's just build up as many tools in the toolbox as you can, because certainly if let's say you get into academia and you want a postdoc or something like that, and you want to get in something very specific, that's related to human health or pharma or something like that, certainly you're going to need to be laser focused, and you're going to need to be really good at just that, especially if you're doing in the human side, because there's lots and lots of competition.
Yeah.
It's a big field. And in poultry, certainly you can have your area of expertise and be specific, but it also helps to be fairly well-rounded, because in animal health, where a lot of it is being a generalist. So you need to be able to adapt to new fields of research, just because you tend to, with an animal health company, I'll say from my own experience, from an animal health company that you work for, you're going to typically wear more hats than you would maybe at just a pharma company or a straight up biotech company. So having that well-rounded sort of background to accompany your maybe specific area of expertise, I think is going to serve you really well in getting ahead in the industry.
Well, we're before the Black Friday shopping, but you're saying I should get a Craftsman rolling toolbox, right, instead of a little handheld. Like those are going to serve you.
I love the analogy. Only you could come up with an analogy that good. Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. Yes.
We need that beast that it's never moving from the garage because there's so much stuff in it.
Yeah.
Organized.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, thank you again for having this chat. It's been a real pleasure, and I always learn. Even if I know my interviewee pretty well, I always learn something about you. So.
Well, no, thanks for having me, Liz. It was a pleasure to be here and pleasure to speak with you as always. So thanks a lot for having me.